Ken, like yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Guyana's Oil and You. I'm your hostess, editor at Kaieteur News, Guyana, and this evening we have with us a very distinguished guest. Her name is Dr. Valerie Marcel. For those of you who may not know her, she's an associate fellow at Chatham House and founder and project lead for their New Producers Group. If you're not familiar with this group, it's a knowledge sharing network of 30 emerging oil and gas producer countries. Dr. Marcel is also an expert on both the governance of the petroleum sector and policies that enable an orderly exit from it in the global south. She's also worked for over 2 decades with leading energy groups, and she has been a key advisor to several governments on energy policy and governance. Dr. Marcel, you're no stranger to the program. Welcome, and thank you for making the time to speak with us this evening.
Thanks, Guyana. It's my pleasure to be here.
Great. So I know that time is limited on both of our ends, so I'll head straight into our program. The last time that we spoke, we had quite a discussion on local content and some of the things that Guyana needs to get done in order to make maximum use of its oil resources. So since speaking from that time, Guyana has been a producer since 2019, and I would love to start off with your take on how we have performed since producing in 2019.
Well, it's clear that Guyana has been sort of settling into its role, its new identity as an oil producer. So I think that, there's a new confidence that comes with that. And I think that's quite, you can sense that in speaking to people that it's not as fresh and uncertain as it was maybe 2 years ago. So I think there's, through this time, a building of institutions and capacity and policies, and with that comes that greater confidence in the role. And so I think that's quite obvious. I think there are still, of course, questions that appear during this show, whether the arrival of oil clashes with other goals, and you realize what comes with it, the risks that come with it as well. So I think it opens up a bit of a Pandora's box, as Guyana is probably discovering.
Yes, we are. And, a lot of the attention has been on oil since 2015. But now, as we are finding more resources and sort of understanding what our needs are and where we want to go, some of the attention is now being placed on gas. And this is where, I'd love to have your input. In your view, do you believe we're heading down the right road by bringing gas to shore when we look around the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is being told, hey, it's time to go to renewables? So how would you sort of evaluate that? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's the critical question, really, is how much does Guyana, as a new producer, want to follow the path of countries like Trinidad and Tobago that have used as much of their oil and gas as possible to create petroleum value? Like, it amounts now to a chain of dependence on the oil and gas, because all industries are using it as feedstocks. Cars are being driven with cheaper petrol, subsidized. They have refining. So they've created a whole industry and a whole economy around it. And Guyana, starting today, does it go down that route, or is it pulled towards a different identity and a different development path? The fact that Guyana has, is it 93% forest cover or 94% forest cover?
Yes.
I mean, it's a carbon sink. It has an identity as a green state.
Yes.
so there's those two competing kinds of visions for of course, I don't think Guyana is going to want to go down the route of Trinidad and Tobago, but is it going to want to keep the pure focus on the carbon sink and maintaining the pristine forests, sacrificing potential industrial developments, and having gas as a cheap feedstock for some industry? It's once you get into the details that you realize, oh, well, I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of that green model to get some of the Trinidad economic prosperity. Mm-hmm. So I think, the gas question is really part of that. I think it's kind of thinking, it's a really complicated one. I have to say, gas is the most complicated issue that the countries that are part of the New Producers Group have to tackle. Well, because it can be perceived as a transition fuel, though yes. That concept itself has become really like a hot button issue in the world of climate. Because if you think of it as a transition fuel that helps you reduce your heavy fuel oil consumption, reduce your emissions, so that later you're transitioning towards a fully green, you have a green energy mix. The reality is that it locks you into a carbon intensive energy use, because once you put in place the infrastructure, it's not for 10 years, it's for 20 to 30 years. So it's expensive infrastructure. So once it's in place, you have to sort of make it worth it. And so you get locked into it. So that's why it doesn't necessarily have that full transition fuel potential. But we are, I think the reality is that most countries in the New Producers Group, and Guyana also is one of them, has persistent energy gaps and is very reliant on heavy fuel oil. So you do think in the short term, yes, it really makes sense to use gas to reduce that carbon intensity. But it's when you look at the long-term issue that is really difficult. The other thing is that I think gas is often not affordable once it comes to shore. So a critical factor in looking at gas use in your energy mix is it's not just the price you pay for it at the source, it's the price of it once it comes to shore and is processed and is made available to the consumer. So that's a critical factor. And the other one is getting all of the pieces of the puzzle in sequence at the right time for when the gas is available. Otherwise, you have to flare it. So we can kind of unpack some of these issues. It's complex, really.
So that's a very interesting perspective that you've offered there. And I'd love for us to start unpacking it, starting with the point that you mentioned there about transitioning. And the message that we've often heard since the government expressed interest in bringing this project on stream is to say, well, hey, gas is less carbon intensive as opposed to heavy oil. And so we'll actually be reducing our carbon footprint. Therefore, why not go to gas? But with what you're saying is we're actually running the risk of taking ourselves further down the rabbit hole, because once you put the infrastructure in place, it's really hard to get out of that. So you would spend, for example, we are proposing to spend $900 million on the gas to shore project, but you would not want to do $900 million just to last you for 20 years. Exactly. So it becomes now, well, you're going to be taking yourself much longer to get out of gas as opposed to, moving to renewables or trying to change your game plan. So in the absence of that, Dr. Marcel, what I'd like to ask you is, if we don't bring the gas to shore, but we continue with the discoveries, I mean, there's only so much we can re-inject. So the possibility of flaring really is even much more, it's greater, would you say?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's what's interesting about the Guyana situation is that there's a lot more associated gas than was initially thought.
Yes.
So the volumes are really significant. And if it's either you slow down oil production to have less associated gas so that you can re-inject what comes up with the oil, or there's not really much else you can do except for flaring, which is obviously not what Guyana would want. So that requires difficult choices. If you're slowing down production, that is a deliberate policy decision, and it can absolutely make sense to do that. The timeline is Guyana's timeline, no one else's timeline, not the company's timeline. But I think another potential sort of way to mitigate the long-term emissions from having gas come to shore is to plan for the gas infrastructure to be transformed into a hydrogen. So, it can be quite easily, I think, repurposed for hydrogen use. So with time, Guyana could be transitioning to a hydrogen-based economy in terms of how the substituting for the gas. So that's an interesting avenue. It's not a solution for today, but in the long term.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, I'd like to turn your attention to comments that have been made about the resources that Guyana has been discovering. On one hand, you have a section of the industry that says, Guyana is bound for success. It's bound to receive lots and lots of wealth. And then there's the other part of the divide that says, well, the discoveries and the fact that Guyana is moving to monetize it as quickly as possible is sort of a scary prospect, because it's now making Guyana a carbon bomb with how fast it's moving. How do you see that perspective?
Yes, it's difficult because, of course, the sector has a somewhat limited life now. We know that the market is going to start to shrink over time. And so as a producer, the economic response is to say, produce as quickly as you can while there's still a market for your oil. That's sort of a purely economic kind of rationale in that situation. But that has to be balanced against the risks to the economy. For example, creating real resource curse issues, like how do the other sectors compete with the oil sector? The cost of labor will increase, the cost of importing goods is going to increase. There's going to be sort of an inflationary kind of pressure that will make the other sectors less competitive, especially for export. There's also the flooding of revenues will change the culture. It will change the political cultures. Certainly, and political, it creates a lot of competition for the rent. So, I think squirreling as much of it as possible into a sovereign wealth fund does make sense in the case of a country like Guyana, because your economy is small. And so flooding your economy with these revenues would certainly not be wise, because you'll really feel just, the competing with the big elephant in the room at all times. But maybe you were thinking of some different risks when you were talking about the carbon bomb.
So in speaking about that, and I do take your points and thank you very much for that. In referring to the carbon bomb, there are climate activists who have said that Guyana needs to perhaps slow down on how quickly it's developing, because it comes a point where you say, well, how much are we actually going to discover and how much will you actually monetize when you have this very short window to that the many countries have signed on to, which is to reduce carbon emissions by significantly by 2050. So how do you still pursue all of that? Or is there some point where we say, this is enough, let's deal with what we have, or else we may just risk becoming a really significant producer of carbon instead of being a carbon sink? So from a climate perspective, are we undoing some of the work and the reputation that we have as being a carbon sink by trying to extract as much and explore as much and develop as much?
Yes, certainly it's difficult to be such a significant producer and be a carbon sink. I mean, I think the potential for Guyana to maintain that sort of green label that it has, I think is in question when you're thinking of perhaps setting up a refinery, or of bringing gas to shore and creating an industrial park with gas feedstocks that might be below international price. So that creates a lot of emissions. There's, opening up the hinterland with the infrastructure and interconnectors. I think it does also sacrifice some of the forest. The minimal resources that are in the forests are also now of greater interest. I think there are a lot of threats to the green label, going forward. And it's more than a label; it's really like an identity, yes, and a richness. It's a real resource wealth for Guyana. So there are always these threats to that kind of real, wealth, and so there has to be stakeholders and civil society in Guyana that care enough to put pressure on government over time to protect that, because there are different public goods. Some are, prosperity and a lot of resources to invest in education and healthcare, and there's also the green wealth and contribution to the global climate. And so I think at the national level, there has to be a constant discussion of, but this really matters. We have to protect this, and how are we going to do it, and what are we going to sacrifice to continue protecting it? So those are, ongoing. Those will have to be ongoing discussions within Guyana, I think, to arrive at the right prioritization of policies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marcel. On that note as well, I know that the New Producers Group, I would have seen the report that was done at the end of 2020. And there was a lot that was said about the path each country may want to take to developing a low carbon economy. So with that, I'd like to ask you, is there any wrong or right way in doing this? And if so, what are some of the pitfalls a country like Guyana should avoid in trying to pursue such an ideal?
Well, I think one of the key things that we're identifying in the group is the need to break the silo that the petroleum sector is usually managed in. It happens in a bit of a bubble, and it ignores often the nationally determined contributions or the sort of climate targets the country has, because the petroleum sector is somewhat of an exception. I guess it benefits from a lot of attention within government and within society, but there's no real sort of conversation about what the externalities are, or what the implications of having oil and gas are for the other public goods that you might have, right? So if you have oil and gas, what happens to your focus on renewables development? Do you kind of put that a bit to the side? That's a bit the risk also with bringing gas to shore, right? Is that if you have all this gas, are you going to keep the focus on the renewables component of the energy mix? It can be difficult to keep steady focus on those other goals that you might have. And that's, the focus on the low carbon pathway can be somewhat relegated to the side when you have the shiny new oil and gas sector. So I think finding the areas of alignment are critical. So terms, if you're deciding to develop your oil and gas, to do it in a way that minimizes emissions from the sector. So no flaring, to really controlling methane leakage, sort of fugitive emissions that can be undetected if you're not being very careful. Increasing renewable energy use at the oil and gas platforms, and using that as a sort of piggyback to get renewables elsewhere in the country. Finding opportunities to, as like a mantra, really to reduce emissions everywhere you can, which is the low carbon development path. Because I think if you're not careful with that, you do create you have a lot of emissions that make your sector less resilient, as carbon prices will increase over time. And it makes your economy less prepared for the time where that carbon price will be high, and you won't have the sort of competitive low carbon that can survive beyond oil and gas. So you want to have that sort of really long-term view of creating jobs, creating SMEs in Guyana that are going to be needed, whose skills and goods and services will be needed in 30 years after oil and gas. So I think that's the key thing, is really seeing that the world is changing. It's the steps to be competitive and resilient in that decarbonizing system.
Thank you very much. Dr. Marcel, there are two questions that I'd like to close with. The first one has to do with the fact that Guyana, we're making so many discoveries. Just earlier today, ExxonMobil announced that it made 2 discoveries, Whiptail 1, Whiptail 2. So we're now to 22 discoveries in Guyana. So with that, there's this dream of the measurable wealth that is going to come our way, but yet we are still lagging behind in the institutional and the regulatory framework that we need to effectively manage this sector. So I wanted to talk, on that note, I wanted to talk a bit about the risks that are associated with sort of moving too fast. And one of those risks is being able to meet some of the requirements in terms of local content. ExxonMobil wants to bring 10 FPSOs in this decade, but we're still unable to meet, in terms of local content, the requirements for Liza 1. How do you, by moving at this stage with this rapid development, do you think we're putting ourselves on this sort of back end?
It's difficult, yes. I think the fast pace is, like I said earlier, I think having a fast pace enables makes Guyana a very attractive place to invest in for companies like Exxon, because they can quickly monetize their assets. It reduces risks for them. But for countries, it does position them well so that they have a high production capacity at the time where there's still a market for their oil. But it comes at a lot of risks in terms of, do you have a real capacity to supply these, to develop the whole supply chain that could really be, give you significant local content in these projects. But then also, do you have the institutions with the regulatory muscle to be able to challenge companies and say, well, we don't want flaring and you have to slow it down, or we don't want, we're going to slow down the review of the field development plan to give us time to really rethink what we're going to do with the associated gas. Or, I don't know what the question might be, but governments do need to take the time to consider all the variables and how they can maximize the interests and the benefits to the country with each of these. And it just is very difficult to do at a fast pace because governments have 3 months to review a field development plan in most cases. And it's a huge document with incredibly significant implications for the country. So on the local content aspect, does it make sense for Guyana to be able to have a whole value chain, industrial value chain that would, say, supply major components of an FPSO while the world is transitioning to decarbonized systems? I'm not sure, because even Nigeria, with its long history, has struggled to supply that kind of local content. It is now doing it, but it was on the back of years of experience with the petroleum sector. I'm just not sure whether some of those investments might become stranded over time. So I think with local content development, there's really a need now to think carefully, will we have enough time to recuperate the value of the investment we've put into these skills or this supply base? How many years of returns do you have? And is it a good investment? I think there's a new lens that we have to put on all of this thinking now, which is really that transition lens, creating dependencies or vulnerabilities to carbon risk that increases over time.
Thank you, Dr. Marcel. And my final question, with the pandemic accelerating the energy transition that we're seeing now, and Guyana is still moving to understand the gamut of the resources that it has out there, what is your advice for us in the lessons that we are seeing coming out from the pandemic and the phenomenon of stranded assets? What's your advice for us?
Well, I think in the discussions we've had in the New Producers Group, we asked whether the COVID era was a bit of a dress rehearsal for what the oil sector would sort of witness in future with the energy transition. And it's interesting, when prices were low, most of the group was thinking, yes, this is it. We're in the energy transition. We're losing our oil sectors. And now that prices have come back up, somehow we're forgetting all of our insights that we had. And I think it's really, I think a weakness in all of our thinking is that how much we are reactive to these price signals. And when we have to remember there are longer term trends. There are things that we've identified irrespective of the oil price. And we have to have a focus on that, I think, and think, we are seeing some deep industrial changes and policy changes, and these are there irrespective of oil prices going up and down. And so I think that's quite a lesson that we've had in our group from the COVID era, is that you do need to maintain the sort of the caution and prudence that governments really had during the when the pandemic really hit, to retain some of that, because I think if you have that real caution and prudence in your planning, you are much more resilient after, because you're much more cognizant of the risks that exist around you and aren't over inflating your expectations of success and becoming rich, basically.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Marcel. It's really been a pleasure to have your insight as part of our program. And I'm certain that our viewers on Facebook Live, as well as our radio listeners, they too would have learned quite a lot from the expertise that you've shared with us. So I would like to say again, thank you very much for making the time to speak with us this evening.
Thanks very much for having me on the show.
All right. To our viewers and listeners, wherever you are, thanks again for joining us. And we ask that you continue to be safe, practice social distancing, and please, if you haven't already, please get your vaccines.